Hey everyone, let me say some things about this John Berger text, first chapter of his book Ways of Seeing. The first thing I want to say is that this is our first example in this class of aesthetics, Aesthetics. That word aesthetics, the simplest way to think of that is just that it means the philosophy of art, right? So art, visual art, music, film, etc., all falls under aesthetics. But I want to draw attention to the word itself for a second. And this word, aesthesis, is in the title of this section of the course. Aesthesis, the word that we get aesthetics from, is the Greek word meaning experience. So while aesthetics has mostly come to be about art and conventions of art, judgments of beauty, things like that, it more basically and etymologically just has to do with how we experience the world, with how our senses interact with the outside world. That's what the word aesthesis, aesthetics, really points to originally, right? So art is a kind of special case of experience, maybe a kind of extreme case of experience of sensory involvement, you might say. But it can also show us things about ordinary experience, about the conditions of our sensory experiences of the world. Right? That's what aesthetics is about. It's a kind of science of experience through the senses. Right? Aesthesis. So the first question that I put up on Blackboard about this has to do with cultural mystification. I think is probably the most important concept for you to get from this text. What does Berger mean by cultural mystification? He identifies it as, quote, the process used to divert attention from what might otherwise be evident. All right, and then he goes on to discuss it in a bunch of other more concrete ways. That's a very general, kind of gestural quote. It gives you a little bit to work with, but I think from the other things that he does with this term throughout this essay, what I think he means by cultural mystification is the attempt by the status quo of the present to determine our confrontations with the past. So basically, the attempt by the forces that determine our present to have power over how you experience and understand the past, right? This is why I brought in the discussion boards the reference to the notion of ideology, which we spent a fair amount of time talking about over the past few weeks. Right? Ideology is what shapes the status quo of the present. I've tried to impress upon you ways in which our present and our everyday realities and assumptions are shaped by liberal ideology in a lot of ways. What Berger is saying is that ideology that shapes our assumptions and understandings of our world, values of what we desire, what we want the society to look like and the world to look like, so that all of these things that ideology does also are able to accomplish that by impacting the ways that we are able to confront the past. And art for Berger is valuable largely because it's a way in which we can confront the past. Right, so he gives the example that he goes through at some length of the art history kind of status quo description of a certain painting, and then he tells you something much more trenchant, which lays bare the kind of real material class relations that went into the actual constitution and production of that painting, right? So cultural mystification is the way in which the status quo of the present gets to impress upon you how you should experience the past. And for Berger to rob the past of some people or some group or even of some individual is to rob it of any means of understanding itself and therefore of any means toward, well, political effectivity, to reference again the term that we used with Martin Alkoff, right? In order for anything to get done, for society to get better, for any kind of emancipation to occur, which I think is at the root of Berger's interests here, the present has to understand itself through an understanding of its past, right? I can let me point to one kind of simple way of illustrating what this point means, right? So assuming, like the hypotheses that I've laid out here, that we live in basically a liberal society determined in our ways of seeing and ways of thinking by liberal ideology. Well, that presumes that that ideology and that version of what the status quo is supposed to look like has some kind of mystificatory influence over how we are able to understand our past, and what art and images are supposed to be, what we expect art to do. I think it's easier to kind of grasp what this point means if we do so by stepping outside of the ideology that we are used to, precisely because that ideology determines to such an extent how we see, how we understand ourselves, our past, etc., how we're able to access history and confront images of history, right? So let's step outside of our ideology and look at a different ideology. Let's look at one of the other ideologies that we talked about, that of communism, for example, right? When the Soviet Union came to be and was trying to, for the first time, establish a true communist society on the face of the earth, right? They laid down certain strictures for what art was supposed to look like. And you've probably seen images of, early Soviet art, Soviet film as well, which was, really avant-garde and advanced for its time. But even so, there are ways in which, all of this art from this era has a certain particular viewpoint and moral in mind that it's supposed to represent, right? It's supposed to make the workers want to work harder. So a lot of images that you'll see is not, images like we're used to in Western, what they would call bourgeois art, right? Portraits of famous gentlemen, or portraits of beautiful women, or whatever. No, I mean, Soviet art would be these kind of raw looking, metallic looking portraits of ideal workers, of patriotic, hardworking proletarians. That's a really clear way in which the ideology of that culture shaped what good art was expected to be. In other words, what an authentic confrontation with, for example, the past that art is able to give you is expected to be. Go watch Eisenstein's film Battleship Potemkin. And you'll get a clear sense of what I'm talking about, of how ideology shapes the expectations that we have for images. Right. So cultural mystification is basically the present stepping into your understanding of the past and of yourself, which necessarily involves a kind of reference and circuit through that past. Okay. Question two, what attitude should we have toward reproductions of art and toward originals? I'm going to be more brief on this point. So toward reproductions, I think Berger thinks that we should have a kind of self-empowering relationship to them. The reproduction of artworks is inherently democratizing, is inherently egalitarian, or tends toward an egalitarian situation, right? Berger thinks. That's because, in part, of the greater mobility and freedom that it gives to these images, right? All of a sudden, you don't have to be someone who, can afford to have a painting commissioned for them by a great artist in order to be able to appreciate art. That refers back to one, kind of state that art was in the past. More recently, zoom forward into the more recent past, you don't have to be able to, take a day off work and go to a museum. If you want to see the Mona Lisa, for example, you don't have to be able to afford a plane ticket to Paris and then to stand in line at that line at the Louvre, which is never not ridiculously long, to go in and see it. You can just go on the internet and see it now, right? Or you can, there was an image of a woman wearing a Mona Lisa t-shirt in Berger's essay that he gave you, right? Which is a really clear example of the reproduction of images and the way, the effects that has of democratization. These images no longer have the kind of exclusivity and prestige that they used to have because they've been reproduced. In our present situation, because they've been digitized. And I'll get to that a little bit with question 3, right? But Berger thinks that this reproduction and increased availability and mobility of images is a democratizing force, is an empowering force, an emancipatory force that gives individuals more power over their relationships with themselves and with the past once again. In other words, the reproduction of images and the appropriation of them by us, the appropriation of them by individuals to kind of buttress our self-understanding, is a force that works against cultural mystification, he seems to think. He thinks it's a good thing. This could very easily be a takeaway that you misunderstand here. You could very easily take away from this text that he thinks the reproduction of text is, or the reproduction of images, sorry, is bad and inauthentic. That's not what he thinks. He thinks it's a good thing. He thinks that it's potentially an empowering thing for individuals seeking to understand themselves, seeking to get things done to empower themselves in the present, in politics, and therefore in understanding their paths toward those ends. Right, so we should have a self-empowering relationship toward the reproduction, toward reproduced images. Berger thinks toward the originals of images, we should have, I think, a sincere confrontation with the work and the person that created it, to the extent that we can, beyond the efforts of the cultural mystification that wants us that wants to obscure that confrontation. Right, the story that Berger told you about the guy, the Belgian or Dutch guy who painted that painting of the dignitaries that he spent at some length explaining cultural mystification through the description that Berger gives you of what went into that painting being constructed is kind of like a lightning bolt, right? After you've read all of this jargon that this other art historian gives you about why you should think this painting is beautiful and how disciplined the composition is and all of that, suddenly Berger tells you this one basic fact about this guy's life, and all of a sudden you have a kind of image of the personality that created this painting. All of a sudden you're transported beyond what this other guy was telling you that you're supposed to be looking at, how the lines suggest each other, and what form of composition this artist is using. Suddenly you're transported beyond all of that mumbo jumbo to an encounter with a person, to an encounter with material problems that you can sympathize with, to a concrete confrontation that also tells you something about class struggle in a very concrete and unavoidable way, right, that this painting is now suddenly representing. You can't forget that story, right? You can't look at that painting again and just not know that anymore. It can't cease to determine the way that you interact with that painting. You can not ever know it in the first place, right? You can look at that painting and just look at it as a beautiful composition, just try to see the formal elements that go into that composition and that make it successful. But once you have that information about the concreteness of the personality that you're interacting with by looking at that painting, once you have that, it can't it can't help but influence the experience that you have of the painting, right? So toward originals, I think he thinks that you should try to strive beyond the forces of cultural mystification going into telling you how you're supposed to experience that painting, and just experience it honestly, experience it sincerely. Go to a museum and try to look at the individual brush strokes. He talks about the phenomenon of painterliness, which he doesn't use that term in the essay, but art historians and artists use this term to refer to aspects of a painting that draw attention to its fact as a physical object, right? So Van Gogh is especially famous for the painterliness of his paintings, because when you go and see an original Van Gogh, you can kind of see the particular, special, unique, once in a lifetime experiences that went into the creation of that painting, right? That brushstroke that you can see that goes into one of those, ears of parts of that field that Berger gives you the image of that Van Gogh painting. If you go and see that painting in real life, you can see these individual brush strokes that, beyond the illusion that the painting is trying to create by making you think that you're really standing in front of this field or whatever, if that's what it's trying to do, that kind of puts you face to face with the concrete experience, the once in a lifetime occasion on which the artist inscribed that painting, right? That brush stroke is something that happened, that the artist did, that they're revealing to you in this kind of vulnerable way, right? It's an experience that you and the artist, in a sense, share, even though you're separated by centuries, potentially. It's a way in which you're able to actually have a confrontation with the experience of that painting being constructed. Once again, remember, aesthetics is about experience and how we experience things. Aesthesis means experience. Okay? So, question 3, moving on, and I'll be quick about this. What has changed since 1972 when this essay was published with respect to image history, cultural mystifications? Well, people haven't really addressed this issue much yet from where I'm recording this right now on the discussion board. But where I was kind of going with this was thinking about, social media and technology and the ways in which there are so many more images now. The reproduction of images has exponentially increased, and also the pliability of images has increased. We can manipulate images to fit our personalities. Your, Instagram or your Facebook is a kind of private museum gallery in which you get to curate what exactly the rest of the world sees by way of images. So I think, if images are what the forces of cultural mystification use to steal our past from us, to steal ourselves from us, our true self-understanding from us, then in a sense, well, the tools that cultural mystification has for those purposes have gotten more diverse and more powerful in a way, right? And we could look at the allegations over the 2016 election and the ways in which other foreign powers were able to use things like Facebook, which are primarily media made of images, in order to shape Americans' understanding of their realities, including understanding of their past, and therefore shape the decisions that they made in electing a president, right? You could look at that particular instance as a way in which images are used for a kind of cultural mystification in a way that wouldn't have been possible in the 70s at the time that Berger was writing. But he did nonetheless see, the ways in which reproductions of images can be used to these ends, these mystificatory ends, or these ideological ends. Right. The last thing I'll say about that actually is that while there might be more and more powerful tools on the part of the status quo or on the part of ideology to use images for the sake of mystification, well, there also might be more pliability of those images and more power on your behalf to do as he said you should do, or as I think he said you should do with reproduced images, which is don't be shy about using them for the sake of your own empowerment. Don't be shy about using them to navigate your self-understanding and to navigate your understanding of your past and the past of history that really belongs to you, right? Remember, he said at one point in this text that history is always a confrontation between past and present, or history is always a relationship between the present and the past. History isn't just the past. History is constantly being enacted and invented now. Our history we primarily have access to through images, right? When you think of the founding of the United States, or when you think of Soviet Russia, or when you think of the Cold War or whatever, the first thing that comes to mind for you is a set of images, right? A set of images that you know from the past. But you didn't choose those images, right? You weren't there at the founding of the United States. So whoever chose those images for you has a certain kind of power over you to decide what you should think and how you should feel in your own life about the historical reality, the past reality that event constitutes for you. The founding of the United States means something in particular for each of us, but it means different things for the various ones of us. And cultural mystification ideology is trying to tell you a story about what that has to mean for you. Berger is saying take that story back, take history back, use images and their malleability and their reproducibility to understand yourself, understand your present through real authentic confrontations with the past and with history, insofar as that's possible beyond what cultural mystification wants to steal from you. Right? That's it for now. Thanks.